In a St. Louis park, a young programmer named Jason King is reading code under a tree when a prejudiced police officer handcuffs him for no reason. But the officer doesn't know. Jason is an undercover CIA agent investigating corruption in his own department. Tensions rise as the truth is revealed, and the stakes become deadly high. The late afternoon sun hung low over Forest Park in St. Louis, painting the sprawling oaks and winding paths with a golden hue. Jason King, a 29-year-old coding prodigy with a secret life, sat beneath a towering tree, his tablet propped against his knee. Lines of code flickered on the screen as his fingers danced over a notebook, scribbling notes in a shorthand only he could decipher. Dressed in a faded hoodie and a Cardinals cap pulled low, he blended into the park's laid-back vibe. Earbuds in, world out. For once, the weight of his double life as a covert CIA operative felt distant. This was his sanctuary, a rare pause from the chaos. But peace never lasted long. Across the lawn, Officer Tom Reed trudged along the gravel path, his heavy boots crunching with each step. At 48, he patrolled these streets for over 2 decades, his instincts honed by years of quick judgments and quicker arrests. His sharp gray eyes scanned the park, always on the lookout for trouble. When they landed on Jason, alone, dark-skinned, too still under that tree, something twisted in Tom's gut. He didn't recognize the kid. Didn't like the way he sat there, calm and unbothered, like he owned the place. In Tom's mind, that spelled suspicion. Never seen him before, Tom muttered, his hand brushing the holster at his hip. He'd heard vague reports of petty thefts nearby. Nothing concrete, just enough to fuel his hunch. Tall, black, male, young. That was the profile in his head, and Jason ticked every box. No evidence, no witness, just a feeling. And for Tom, that was enough. Jason sensed the shift before he saw it. The air grew heavier, the distant hum of park chatter fading under the weight of someone's stare. He glanced up from his tablet, locking eyes with Tom across the grass. The officer's face was hard, jaw tight, a look Jason knew too well. Prejudice dressed up as duty. He'd been here before, too many times. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he slid his tablet aside, resting his hands on his knees, open and visible. No sabemos. Tom closed the distance, his shadow falling over Jason like a storm cloud. Afternoon, he said, voice gruff, an edge cutting through the forced politeness. What's your name? Jason King, he replied, steady and even. Just enjoying the park. Tom's eyes narrowed. Too calm, too collected. Most people stammered or fidgeted under his gaze, but not this guy. It set his nerves on edge. ID, he barked, holding out a hand. Jason exhaled softly, reaching for his pocket with deliberate slowness. He pulled out a slim wallet and handed over a driver's license. One of his fakes, clean and untraceable, part of his cover. Tom snatched it, squinting at the name. Jason King, huh? What are you doing out here all alone? Reading, Jason said, nodding at the tablet. Catching some air. Tom scoffed, barely glancing at the screen. Sure you are. You from around here? Close enough, Jason said, keeping it vague. He wasn't about to give this guy his life story, or the truth about his mission. The non-answer fueled Tom's unease. He stepped closer, looming over Jason, his hand now resting on his baton. You don't look like you belong here, kid. Mind standing up? Jason's jaw tightened, but his face stayed neutral. He knew the game, knew his rights, too. Sitting in a public park wasn't a crime. But he also knew how fast this could spiral if he pushed back. Am I under arrest? He asked, voice low, meeting Tom's glare head-on. Tom bristled, the kid's composure grating on him. You will be if you don't cooperate, he snapped. Stand up. Now. For a beat, the two locked eyes, Jason steady, Tom's simmering with frustration. The park around them faded, joggers and dog walkers blurring into the background. Jason weighed his options. He could flash his real badge, end this in seconds. But that would blow his cover, unravel months of work tracking a corruption ring tied to this very precinct. No, he'd play along for now. With a slow nod, he rose to his feet, hands still visible. Whatever you say, officer. Tom smirked, pulling out his cuffs. Turn around. The metal clicked shut around Jason's wrists, cold and tight. A few onlookers paused, whispering, phones creeping out to record. Tom ignored them, yanking Jason toward the patrol car parked near the lot. Let's see what you're really up to, he muttered, shoving him forward. Jason stayed silent, his mind racing. He wasn't worried about himself. He'd been trained for worse. But as the car door slammed shut behind him, he couldn't shake the irony. Tom thought he'd caught a criminal. He had no idea he'd just handcuffed the man who could bring his whole world crashing down. The fluorescent lights of the St. Louis precinct buzzed overhead as Officer Tom Reed shoved Jason King into a stark, gray holding room. The door clanged shut, echoing off the concrete walls. Jason stumbled slightly, the cuffs biting in his wrists, but he straightened up fast, his face a mask of calm. Tom loomed in front of him, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. Sit, he barked, jerking his chin toward a metal chair bolted to the floor. Jason complied, slow and deliberate, his mind already 3 steps ahead. Tom paced, boots thudding against the tiles. You think you're slick, huh? Sitting out there like you own the damn park. What's your game, King? His voice dripped with disdain, each word a jab. Jason met his gaze, unflinching. No game, officer. Just a guy with a tablet. Bull, Tom spat, slamming a hand on the table between them. Guys like you don't just sit around reading. I've been on this beat 20 years. I know trouble when I see it. Jason raised an eyebrow, letting the silence stretch. He could have ended this right then, flashed his CIA creds, and watched Tom's bravado crumble. But that wasn't an option. Not yet. His mission hung by a thread, and Tom was the key to unraveling it. See, Jason wasn't just a coder with a knack for puzzles. For months, he'd been embedded in St. Louis, tracking a corruption ring that snaked through the precinct. Dirty cops, hush money, deals with a local crew called the River Rats. Tom Reed was the linchpin, and Jason had audio files to prove it. One wrong move now, and that evidence could vanish. So he played the part, kept his cover, even as Tom's ego pushed the situation closer to the edge. Run his prints, Tom called over his shoulder to Officer Dan Kelly, a wiry rookie hovering near the door. Dan nodded, grabbing Jason's fake ID and disappearing down the hall. Tom turned back, leaning in close, his breath hot with coffee and contempt. You're hiding something. I can smell it, and I'm going to dig it out. Jason tilted his head, voice cool. Dig all you want. You won't find what you're looking for. It was a calculated taunt, just enough to keep Tom distracted. The officer's jaw clenched, his patience fraying. We'll see about that, he growled, storming out and slamming the door behind him. Alone, Jason flexed his hands behind his back, testing the cuffs. Tight, but not a problem. He'd slipped worse. His real worry was time. Every minute in here risked exposure. His CIA handler had strict orders. No contact unless the mission blew wide open. If those prints hit the wrong database, this could spiral fast. Outside, Dan hunched over a computer in the booking room, tapping Jason's info into the system. The screen blinked, then froze. A red alert flared across it, restricted access. Dan blinked, rubbing his eyes. What the hell? He tried again, but the system locked him out, a faint chime pinging from the speakers. Somewhere deep in a CIA server, a flag went up. Jason's cover ID had tripped a wire. Dan bolted from his chair, snagging the printout and racing to Captain Emily Walker's office. She was hunched over a stack of case files, ginger, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, when he burst in. Captain, you need to see this, he panted, thrusting the paper at her. Emily's sharp green eyes flicked over the alert. Her pulse quickened. She'd seen a lot in her decade running this precinct, but this was new. Restricted access? She muttered, grabbing her phone. She dialed a secure line only she and a few others knew existed. This is Walker. I need answers on Jason King. Now. On the other end, a clipped voice responded, stand by. Seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Then the voice returned, low and urgent. King's one of ours. Hey, yeah, you got a problem, Captain, because he's not the criminal here. Emily's grip tightened on the phone. Her mind raced. Tom had dragged in an agent, and she'd bet her badge he didn't even know the half of it. She hung up, staring at the alert still glowing on Dan's printout. "Get Reed back here," she snapped, "and keep King where he is. This just got messy." Back in the holding room, Jason leaned back in the chair, the faint hum of the precinct filtering through the walls. He didn't need to hear the footsteps pounding down the hall to know the clock was ticking. Tom thought he'd caught a nobody. Soon, he'd learn he'd just kicked a hornet's nest, and Jason was the sting. The air in Captain Emily Walker's office crackled with tension as she hung up the phone, her mind spinning from the CIA's bombshell. Jason King wasn't just some random guy Tom Reed had hauled in from Forest Park. He was an undercover agent, and this precinct was his target. Her precinct. Emily's sharp green eyes darted to the restricted access alert still glowing on Dan Kelly's printout, a red warning that screamed trouble. She leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming the desk. Tom had screwed up, big time, and she needed to move fast before this blew up in all their faces. "Dan," she said, her voice like steel, "find Reed. Now, and don't let King out of that room." Dan nodded, his wide eyes betraying his nerves as he bolted out the door. Emily stood, smoothing her uniform, her mind racing through the implications. If Jason was CIA, he wasn't here for petty thefts. He was after something, or someone, inside her house. And Tom, with his hot temper and old-school instincts, was the prime candidate. Down the hall, Jason sat in the holding room, cuffs still pinching his wrists. The faint buzz of the precinct filtered through the walls. Phones ringing, voices overlapping, the usual chaos. He kept his breathing steady, his face a blank slate, but inside his thoughts churned. The prince had gone through. He felt the shift the second Dan left with his fake ID. If that alert hit the right channels, his cover could hold, or it could crack wide open. Either way, he wasn't worried about himself. He'd trained for this. What mattered was the mission, nailing Tom Reed and the corruption ring he anchored. Meanwhile, Tom stormed through the precinct's bullpen, his heavy footsteps echoing off the linoleum. He'd left Jason to stew, figuring a little pressure would loosen the kid's tongue. Arrogance clung to him like sweat. He was sure he'd sniffed out trouble in the park, sure his gut never lied. But as he rounded the corner to his desk, a prickle of unease crept up his spine. Something felt off. The way Dan had scurried out, the hushed whispers from the booking room. He shook it off, muttering, "Just another punk," and yanked open his desk drawer. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old reports, sat a small black USB drive, his insurance policy. It held recordings of his deals with the River Rats, a local crew running drugs through St. Louis. 10% of every haul, cash under the table, all caught on tape by a paranoid partner who'd since gone quiet. Tom's hand shook as he grabbed it, glancing over his shoulder. If Jason was more than he seemed, this could bury him. He jammed the drive into his pocket, heart pounding. He'd destroy it later, somewhere safe. But he wasn't fast enough. Dan burst into the bullpen, breathless. "Reed, Captain wants you. Now." Tom froze, his hand still on the drawer. "What's this about?" he snapped, but Dan's jittery silence said plenty. Tom cursed under his breath and followed, the USB a dead weight against his thigh. In her office, Emily waited, arms crossed, her gaze cutting through the room like a blade. When Tom barged in, she didn't waste a second. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to a chair. Tom hesitated, his bulk filling the doorway, then slumped down, defiance etched into his scowl. "What's going on, Captain?" Emily didn't blink. "You tell me, Reed. That guy you dragged in? Jason King? He's CIA. And he's not here for kicks. He's investigating us." She leaned forward, voice low and lethal. "Care to explain why an agent's sitting in my holding room with your cuffs on him?" Tom's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling. "CIA?" he rasped, the words sticking in his throat. His mind raced. How? Why? He'd pegged Jason for a nobody, a punk with an attitude. But now the pieces clicked. The calm demeanor, the vague answers. He'd misread it all. Panic clawed at him, the USB burning a hole in his pocket. I didn't know, Captain. You fit the profile, tall, black, acting shady. I was doing my job. Your job." Emily's tone sharpened. "You profiled him, Reed. No evidence, no cause, just your damn gut. And now we've got a federal mess on our hands. She pulled out her phone, thumbing to a hidden app Jason had slipped her intel on, a live feed from a mic he'd worn in the park. She hit play. Tom's own voice crackled through. "You don't belong here, kid. Let's see what you're hiding." Tom's stomach dropped. "That's not," he started, but Emily cut him off. "Save it. I've got a call from Langley saying King's been tracking corruption. Guess who's on his radar?" She held up the phone, and another voice, Tom's, spilled out, 10% cash only. "Keep it quiet." The room spun. Tom lunged for his pocket, fumbling for the USB, but Dan was faster, grabbing his arm. "Don't move," the rookie hissed, pinning him back. Emily stood, towering over him. "You're done, Reed. Whatever you've got in there, it's over." Tom's world tilted. He'd thought he'd caught a criminal. Instead, he'd handed Jason the key to his own downfall. And the chaos was just beginning. The air in Captain Emily Walker's office was thick with the weight of betrayal as Tom Reed slumped in a chair, his hand still twitching toward the USB in his pocket. The faint hum of the precinct beyond the walls felt miles away, drowned out by the damning echo of his own voice spilling from Emily's phone. 10% cash only. Keep it quiet. The recording looped in his head, each word a nail in the coffin he'd built himself. Dan Kelly stood over him, one hand firm on his shoulder, while Emily's piercing gaze pinned him like a specimen under glass. "You've got nothing to say, Reed." Emily's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and unyielding. She tossed the phone onto her desk, the screen still glowing with the audio file Jason King had slipped her, a live wire from his covert mic. "That's you, isn't it? Selling out this precinct to the river rats." Tom's mouth opened, then shut, his throat dry as sandpaper. "It's not what it sounds like," he croaked, but the lie crumbled before it hit the air. His eyes darted to the door, then back to Emily, desperation creeping in. "I was protecting the streets, keeping the peace. You don't get how it works out there." Emily leaned forward, her face inches from his. "Don't you dare. You don't protect anything by pocketing blood money. You're a disgrace to the badge." Her words landed like blows, and Tom flinched, his bravado unraveling. He'd spent decades convincing himself he was the good guy, the tough cop who bent rules to keep order. Now, that illusion was ash. The door creaked open, and Jason King stepped in, his wrists free of cuffs, his posture calm but commanding. The room shifted under his presence. Tom's head snapped up, his gut twisting at the sight of the man he'd dismissed as a nobody. Jason's dark eyes locked onto him, steady and unflinching, carrying the weight of months spent in the shadows, piecing together Tom's crimes. "Captain," Jason said, voice smooth as steel. "Mind if I take it from here?" Emily nodded, stepping back, her trust in him unspoken but absolute. Jason pulled a chair across from Tom and sat, resting his forearms on the table. "Let's talk, Officer Reed. About the rats. About the cash. About how you thought you'd get away with it." Tom's hands balled into fists, his knuckles white. "You set me up," he snarled, lunging forward, but Dan yanked him back into the seat. "You planted that tape." Jason didn't blink. "I didn't plan anything. You did this to yourself. Every word on that recording? Yours. Every deal you cut? I've got dates, names, drop points, months of it. You're not slipping out of this." He slid a small recorder from his pocket, clicking it on. Tom's voice filled the room again, this time haggling over a shipment down by the docks. The evidence was ironclad, and Tom's defiance cracked. "Why?" Jason pressed, leaning in. 20 years on the force, and you throw it away for what? Extra cash. Power. Tom's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered, staring at the floor. "The streets are a war zone. I was surviving." "Surviving?" Jason's tone hardened. "You preyed on the people you swore to protect. That's not survival. That's cowardice." He paused, letting the words sink in, then turned to Emily. "He's yours, Captain. But this isn't just about him. The rats don't run without a network. There's more here. Cops, informants, loose ends." Emily nodded, her jaw tight. "We'll dig. Every last thread." She turned to Tom, her voice cold. "You're suspended, Reed. Effective immediately. Hand over your badge." Tom's hand trembled as he unpinned the shield from his chest, the metal clinking as it hit the desk. It wasn't just a badge. It was his identity, his pride, everything he'd clung to. Now it was gone, and the void swallowed him whole. "You don't know what you're starting," he whispered, a last gasp of defiance. "We're ending it," Emily shot back. "Dan, get him out of here. Lock him in holding until we sort this mess." Dan hauled Tom to his feet, guiding him out, his steps heavy with defeat. The door shut behind them, leaving Emily and Jason alone in the charged silence. Jason rubbed his wrists, the ghost of the cuffs still lingering. "You've got a fight ahead, Captain," he said, meeting her gaze. "This precinct's rotten deeper than Reed. I could walk away, mission's done, but I'm asking, you ready to fix this?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, resolve hardening her features. "I've been ready. This isn't just a cleanup, it's a rebuild. You in?" Jason nodded, a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. "Yeah, let's tear it down and start over." The truth was out. Tom was cornered, but the real battle, for justice, for change, was just igniting. The St. Louis precinct hummed with a strange, subdued energy as dawn broke over the city, casting pale light through the windows. Captain Emily Walker stood in the bullpen, her voice steady as she addressed a room full of officers. "What happened here, with Reed, with the corruption, it stops now," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "We're not just cleaning house. We're rebuilding trust. Starting today, every one of you gets mandatory training. Bias, de-escalation, accountability. No exceptions." Murmurs rippled through the group, some nods, some wary glances, but Emily's resolve was ironclad. Change was coming, whether they liked it or not. Across town, Tom Reed sat in a holding cell, his plain clothes a stark contrast to the uniform he'd worn for decades. The clang of the bars still echoed in his ears from the night before, when Dan had locked him in after Emily's order. His badge was gone, his career ashes, and now a courtroom loomed ahead. The River Rats tapes, Jason's evidence, had been handed to the DA, and charges were piling up: bribery, extortion, conspiracy. Tom stared at the concrete floor, his hands clasped tight. He'd told himself he was surviving the streets, but the truth stared back. He'd sold his soul, and the price was due. Jason King stepped out of the precinct's front doors, the cool morning air hitting his face like a cleanse. His mission was done. Tom exposed, the corruption ring cracked open, but he lingered, hands in his pockets, watching the city wake up. Forest Park stretched in the distance, its trees a quiet promise against the skyline. He'd come close to blowing his cover, to losing everything, but he'd held the line. Now, the question gnawed at him: walk away, or stay and fight the bigger war? Inside, Emily pinned a notice to the bulletin board: dates for the new training sessions, a hotline for community complaints, a pledge to transparency. She caught sight of Jason through the glass doors and stepped out to join him. "You're still here," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Thought you'd be halfway to D.C. by now." Jason shrugged, his Cardinals cap casting a shadow over his eyes. "Thought about it. But this," he nodded toward the precinct, "it's not finished. You've got a shot at something real here, Captain. I like to see it through." Emily crossed her arms, studying him. "You don't have to. You've done your part. More than most would." "Maybe," he said, turning to face her. "But I've seen too many places like this limp along, patching holes instead of fixing the foundation. You're different. You're not just talking change. You're doing it. I can help. Not as an agent, but as, I don't know, a consultant. Someone who's been on both sides." Her smile widened, genuine this time. "I'd be a fool to say no. Welcome aboard, King." They shook hands, a pact sealed in the quiet of the morning. Emily glanced back at the precinct. "First session's tomorrow. Think you can handle a room full of skeptical cops?" Jason chuckled, the sound light against the weight of the past weeks. "I handled Reed. I'll manage." Later that day, Tom faced his reckoning. A pair of officers escorted him from the cell to a waiting van, his wrists cuffed. Ironic, after all the times he'd done the same to others. As they passed the bullpen, he caught snippets of Emily's reforms: new oversight, body cam audits, community outreach. His legacy was a warning now, a lesson carved into the precinct's future. He didn't look back as the van doors shut. Jason returned to Forest Park that afternoon, settling under the same oak where it all began. His tablet lay beside him, but he didn't open it. Instead, he watched the joggers, the kids chasing frisbees, the ordinary rhythm of life he'd fought to protect. The weight of his double life lifted just a little. He'd exposed Tom, handed Emily the tools to rebuild, and now he'd stay to see it through, not as a shadow, but as a voice. Emily's words echoed in his mind. We're rebuilding trust. It wouldn't be easy. The precinct had scars, the community had doubts, and change was a slow burn. But as the sun climbed higher, bathing the park in gold, Jason felt a spark of something rare. Hope. Justice had won this round, not with fists or guns, but with truth and resolve. He picked up his notebook, jotting a single line, day 1. Then he stood, cap pulled low, and walked back toward the precinct. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, he'd face it in the light.